Sorry, just snacking on my favorite Inca dish. You probably thought popcorn was invented for the movies, but I've just come back from Peru, where the Inca people were popping popcorn more than 500 years ago. I'm Arizona Smith. My work as an archaeologist takes me all around the world, but one of my favorite places is South America, home of the Inca. The Inca Empire stretched more than 2,500 miles down the length of the Andes Mountains and included close to 9 million people. That's a lot of land and a lot of people for a single emperor to control, but the Inca Empire was incredibly powerful for its time. Its size and efficiency rivaled the Roman Empire at its peak. The Inca Empire extended over some of the harshest lands on Earth. Its people farmed in the Andes more than 10,000 feet high. They built cities deep within the jungle, and they lived in one of the driest deserts on the planet. They accomplished all of this with no wheel, no system of writing, and no TV. Just kidding, of course they didn't have TV. So how do we know so much about the Inca Empire? Well, for one, they may have built in some pretty out-of-the-way places, but that hasn't stopped archaeologists like me from seeking them out. In the mountainous world of the Inca, stone was sacred. Some rocky peaks like these were even thought to have special powers. Living among these craggy rocks, the Inca were inspired to become some of the greatest builders in history. This is called Ollantaytambo, a special retreat for the emperor. Many of the Inca buildings look like part of the landscape, almost as if they grew there. These may look like steps, but they are actually terraces built for farming on the steep slopes. The Inca were great engineers, too, building gutters and water channels for irrigating their fields that still work well today, 500 years later. The stoneworking skills were handed down from father to son through generations. Unlike modern-day Inca, the ancient Inca worked without iron or steel tools, without nails, even without wheels to help them haul the stones. Yet the great Inca buildings have survived earthquakes, which have toppled many built later. In constructing their buildings, the Inca didn't use mortar, but cut each stone perfectly by hand to cradle the one above it. Some of these stones are more than 20 feet high and weigh more than 100 tons. Even a knife blade won't fit between them. Hundreds of years later, visitors can still admire these great Inca buildings in cities like Cusco. But there were stories about another city, even more beautiful, hidden in the mountains. These stories captured the imagination of an American named Hiram Bingham. In 1911, Bingham set out to find the lost city of the Inca. He traveled through rough country, climbing steep mountains and pushing his way through the rainforest. 7,000 feet above sea level, he found it, the ruins of Machu Picchu. There were the remains of dozens of houses, simple shelters with one room, and larger two-story houses for nobles. One of the most impressive structures was a tower Bingham named the Temple of the Sun. The wall was perfectly curved around a large piece of rock carved to serve as an altar. Up a long stairway was another carved sacred rock. Scholars believe priests could have used it to indicate when to sow and harvest the crops by observing when the rock shadow disappeared in the spring and fall. Before Machu Picchu was abandoned mysteriously in 1532, about 1,200 people lived up here at the top of the world, farming the hillsides. People have been living in the Andes for thousands of years, probably as far back as 12,000 BC. Remember popcorn? Well, the people of the Andes have been growing corn for almost 6,000 years. The Andes were home to many different civilizations, like the Nazca and the Moche, who both lived along the coast of Peru. These civilizations developed ways of farming and created beautiful works of art, which the Inca later adopted as their own. The Inca people settled in the Cusco Valley some 800 years ago and lived there peacefully until a man named Pachacuti took the throne in 1438. He marched armies through the Andes, conquering everybody in his path, and in less than 30 years, he created an empire. He called himself Earthshaker. Before radio and television and instant news, the only way to communicate with the far reaches of an empire was the road. And like the Roman emperors before them, Inca rulers were great road builders. 15,000 miles of roads stretched through jungles, over mountains, and across rivers. Relay runners were stationed miles apart to pass the news along, which could travel as far as 250 miles in a day over the network. The royal couriers were the eyes and ears of the ruler, keeping watch over the empire. Every Inca emperor was called Sapa Inca, which means unique one. The people believed the emperor was descended from the sun, and they treated him like a god. They served his food in gold and silver dishes. Every day, they dressed him in new clothes and burned the old ones. When the Sapa Inca died, his body was mummified, sort of like the ancient Egyptians. But the Inca took it a step further. When important decisions needed to be made, they brought their mummified emperors out and asked them for advice. The Inca felt great respect, not only for the dead emperors, but for all their ancestors.
Inca priests were doctors too. They even performed brain surgeries. Surgeons drilled into the skull with special tools. We can tell that surgeons were very skillful because many Incas lived long after their surgery. Inca doctors also had their own version of stitches. They bit off the heads of large ants and used the ants' jaws as clips to close the wounds. Pretty cool.
Hey, Arizona.
Hey, Steph, what's up?
I just want to show you something really cool that my aunt brought back from Peru. Isn't this beautiful?
It sure is. Looks a lot like an ancient Inca weaving. But, in those days, it took so much time and effort to weave fabric that the Inca considered their finest cloth to be more valuable than gold.
Whoa, that's crazy. Who would want to spend all their time weaving this stuff?
Well, everybody in the community did some kind of craft work. Inca women made all of the family clothing, but men could also weave as they went about their daily chores. Most Inca clothing was made from wool. Guess where it came from?
I know, from all those funny-looking llamas and alpacas. I'll bet their clothing was pretty soft.
You're right, but remember, only the royal family got to wear the finest clothing. You see, Inca society was organized kind of like a pyramid. The emperor, the Sapa Inca at the top, and then below him, his relatives and the noblemen, and then below that, the officials, and then all the way at the bottom, the farmers.
Sounds pretty tough on the farmers.
Well, yes and no. The land was owned all by the emperor, and everyone, and I mean everyone, did some work for the state every year, kind of like an annual tax. If you're a man, you might work on a road building project. If you're a woman, you might weave fine cloth.
What if somebody didn't feel like working?
Not very likely. You see, everybody was part of the community and working for it. Your friends would all be working. You'd be working together. Besides, the Inca state provided everyone with land to cultivate so nobody would go hungry.
Wow, that's neat.
Yeah, sure is. The land was divided into 3 parts. 1/3 of the crops went to the gods, 1/3 of the crops went to the emperor, and 1/3 went to the farmers. Look at how mountainous the land is. It was incredibly tough to farm. But the Incas were smart. They increased the amount of land they could farm by building flat strips, we call them terraces, along the mountainsides. And they dug canals to bring rainwater to the land. This system was so good that the descendants of the Incas still farm that way today.
Well, we know the Inca didn't have the wheel to help them out. But what about horses? Horses must have made life easier.
No horses. You mentioned llamas. They were strong enough to carry things with, but not strong enough to carry most people.
Well, I thought my chores at home were pretty tough, but that dishwasher's looking better all the time. Well, I'm out of here. I gotta get home to my community to do my chores. Bye.
Well, maybe the Inca had something. The Inca may have worked hard, but they also knew how to play. And for them, the biggest celebration of the year was the Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. It's still celebrated today by the descendants of the Inca. This great festival was held every year on June 21st, at the time of the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere. The harvest was over and it was time to thank the sun for the crops, or to ask for better crops next season. The Inca had many gods, but one of the most important was the sun god, Inti. In ancient times, the Sapa Inca would lead the ritual. From a golden cup, he would drink a special beer made from corn, passing it on to others to share. Living at high altitudes has helped the Inca develop lungs which are larger and stronger than normal. They come in handy for dancing. The women still dress much as they did long ago, in a long tunic covered by a shawl, their hair in braids.